Just personal aside, my political activism started in the 1930s. I won't go into the details, but my first political article was on the rise of fascism in Europe, 1939, but then it went on from there. The Vietnam War was the first public, open, visible activism beyond locally. The protest against the Vietnam War was very much too late. It should have begun in the early 50s, but at least it should have begun in 1961 and 62, when the Kennedy administration sharply escalated the war, with the U.S. Air Force participating directly in bombing South Vietnam, chemical warfare to destroy crops, ground cover, and so on, authorization of napalm. It was pretty extreme. That's when it should have started. It didn't. I happened to become active then, but there were very few people. The talks I was giving were a couple of people in a church or something like that. It finally, in many parts of the country, began to develop. It really took significant shape by 1967 or so. Much too late, but significant. At that time, there was also significant resistance, well beyond protest. I personally was much involved in that. And it had an effect. Not enough of an effect. Indochina was virtually destroyed. Destruction was extraordinary, but could have been worse. Probably could have led to nuclear attacks and so on. So there were some constraints imposed, and we even have some evidence about what the constraints were. Well, no time to go into it. But belated, but significant. And it had an effect on the country. One effect was a general opposition to aggression and state violence, which has manifested itself over and over since. It's not discussed in the media. It's barely discussed in the scholarly literature. That's not the kind of thing you want people to know, but it's there. So, for example, when the Reagan administration came in, they determined right away that they wanted to carry out a war in Central America to try to crush the popular movements there. And they tried to emulate what Kennedy did, almost step by step. Same white paper, the same propaganda, I don't know, we don't have records, but I assume they were just looking at it and doing the same thing. Didn't work. In the Kennedy case, it worked. There was no protest. In the Reagan case, it immediately elicited massive protest, popular churches elsewhere, and they had to back off. And instead of directly attacking Central America, they had to carry out what amounted to an international terrorist war, using security forces that they organized in the countries, and also enlisting an international terrorist apparatus. So, for example, in Guatemala, which was the worst case, Congress blocked Reagan from directly supporting the massacres, which actually amounted to genocide in the highlands. So the Reagan administration had to bring in, enlist international terrorists to do it, primarily Israel, which is always willing to perform that task. They sent arms, trainers, and so on to expedite the genocidal activities of the Guatemalan army. Still, take a look at the equipment. It's still Israeli equipment. Taiwan was another one that was brought in. Argentine neo-Nazis were enlisted until Argentina, the dictatorship was overthrown. They couldn't use those anymore. They were the favorite of the Reagan administration. And it devastated Central America, but nothing like Vietnam. Well, let's go on. What about Iraq? The case of Iraq was, I think, the first time in the history of imperialism when a war of aggression, which of course is what it was, an imperial war of aggression, was massively protested before it was officially launched, which is very unusual. Now, it didn't stop the war, and the standard line is it failed. I don't think it failed. The Bush administration couldn't even begin to do the kinds of things that Kennedy and Johnson did almost reflexively because there was no protest. So it was bad enough, practically destroyed Iraq. It's set off sectarian conflicts that are tearing the region to shreds, but again, could have been a lot worse. So I think the general answer is, well, too late, too little, but significant, and over time developing opposition to aggression and violence, which has some constraining effect on natural tendencies of power systems to resort to violence at will. And they do have this tendency. It's entirely open and public. So take, say, Iran today. Across the spectrum, virtually everyone, from the president through the intellectual class, asserts openly, publicly, and with pride that if we determine that Iran is doing something we don't like, we will unilaterally resort to force to stop it. That's announcing loudly as we can that we're a rogue state. We don't care about international law, international opinion, anything. We monopolize the sources of violence, and we'll use them when we choose. And there's no protest about this. Virtually nothing. Way at the fringes, you may get some.